Well, we have as our special guest this evening Professor Larry Berman, who is a very long-standing friend and deep scholar of Vietnam. Larry, you have an enviable academic record. You are now Dean of the Honors School at Georgia State University, but you've been thinking about, publishing about, reflecting on Vietnam from the early 1980s. Long time. And it's a great honor for us to have you here this evening, and thank you very much indeed. I was looking at a website that lets American students rate their professors. Extraordinary idea for Vietnam, that you would actually, in public, talk about how good your professor is. And it's quite clear that there are lots of students who love you and the way you teach, and you particularly help American students understand how government works in America. And during the course of this conversation, I'd love to hear some of your reflections on how you would contrast processes in America and processes in Vietnam. But let's start, if we may, by asking the question, why are you here in Vietnam this time? One of very many visits. What's brought you here this time?
So this is I'm delighted to be here, Paul, especially to have a conversation with you. It means a lot to me. So this trip is different than my previous 55 trips,
Wow.
which I've been making over the past 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
This trip I've brought a delegation from Georgia State University led by the president of Georgia University, Mark Becker. 15 of the 17 people have never been to Vietnam. President Becker and I came together 2 years ago, and I introduced him to Vietnam 2 years ago and took him to institutions of higher education from Hanoi all the way down to Ho Chi Minh City. We met with presidents and students and people in both the consulate and the embassy who deal with education and educational outreach. And his reaction was, one day I want to come back to Vietnam with the foundation board members who want to go and introduce them to this remarkable, dynamic, young country, even though Vietnam is a country with a long history. It's a remarkably young country. And this year, he asked me to organize a trip for the Georgia State Foundation Board, those of them who wanted to go. And we have 17 members in the delegation who have joined me for this trip. And the whole idea of it was for Larry Berman to introduce them to Vietnam through his eyes, meaning my eyes, my books, my writing. And we've been doing that from Hanoi. We took a little excursion, as we all should, to Ha Long Bay, and we went to Hue, and then we came to Ho Chi Minh City. And it's an exciting time to be here during this week in particular.
It's an extraordinary week. Extraordinary week. And a little later on, I want to reflect with you on the fact that we're thinking about 40 years ago, but we might also be thinking about 70 years ago, because that was also a very interesting period in the history of this remarkable country. So here you are introducing a group of very senior people from Georgia State to America. But let's get you to introduce yourself a little bit to us, if we may. Georgia State invited you very recently, 2 years ago, I think, to become Dean of an honors school at Georgia State.
Right.
And they took you away from your previous university in order to do that, where you'd been quite a long time.
Right.
Tell us about this honors school and what you're doing with it.
Yeah. Well, I've been at the University of California, Davis for 35 years.
Yes.
And I was ready to do something new at the at either the last or next to last stage of my life. And this opportunity to be the founding dean of the Honors College at Georgia State came up. And honors colleges in the United States Georgia State is not a unique phenomena here. Public universities all across the United States have honors colleges. It's the way to keep the best and brightest students in the state, offer them the type of education they might get at the finest liberal arts college in the country, but at a fraction of the cost. No cost, actually. Almost all of them have full scholarships. No classes are over 20. They have individual mentorships with professors. They're funded to travel all over the world to do research. They get priority registration. They present papers at research conferences. So honors colleges enhance undergraduate opportunities for students who are motivated, who are bright, and what we think are the real game changers, the future game changers in society. And Georgia State is one of 50 universities in the United States, public universities, that have sought to offer a public Ivy League education to the best and the brightest to keep them from going to those other schools.
And how many students do you have in your honors college?
We admit 250 students a year.
Wow.
Out of 5,000 who are admitted.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about the top cohort of students.
And do you have any people coming from abroad into the honors college?
We do, yes.
Mm-hmm.
We have students from several countries. We recruit actively in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually have just had our first student from Vietnam directly admitted into the Honors College, which is remarkable. Most of the time, students will have to go to Georgia State and enroll in English as a second language for a year or so, because just to get up to par. But in this case, one student, someone who I knew, I actively recruited, is now completing his first year at Georgia State in the Honors College directly. And we hope on this trip we met 2 other students who we think will be joining us. So we're actively recruiting.
So here you are in the last phase of your own academic life, as it were, creating the future for America and beginning to invite Vietnamese students into that process also.
Right. And of course, many American universities, as you know, and British University, but also Australian, we have been active, all of us have been actively involved in creating educational opportunities for Vietnamese students to study in our countries. I mean, this has been very important.
Mm-hmm.
And for me in particular, many years ago, on my very first trip to Vietnam, I was with a delegation from Texas Tech University in Lubbock.
What year would that be?
That was in the year 1999.
1999.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
okay.
2000.
2000. Okay.
And I was being introduced to Vietnam the same way that I am introducing my colleagues now. And one of the things that struck me was how well they were doing at recruiting students from Vietnam and offering scholarships and trying to help students in any way possible. I always wanted to be in a position to do that, and now I am.
Very good, very good. So on this trip, trying to help your colleagues from Georgia State see Vietnam through your eyes,
Yeah.
What's your sense of what they've discovered?
Well, that's a great question. Of course, we just finished our trip a half hour ago, and I was hoping to reflect on this for about 48 hours because I am trying to answer this myself. I've heard a lot of things from them. So this is what I've heard from them. They are really struck by the friendliness of the Vietnamese people everywhere they were. They encountered. They were a little nervous about that.
Mm-hmm.
How would Americans be treated because of the war?
Mm-hmm.
And before we came, I told them that Vietnam, there was a war, but Vietnam is also a country, and it's a remarkably young country. And I tried to prepare them for the fact that something like 65% of the people in the country were born after the war, that there was a dynamism about in this new generation, and that I kept telling them while we're celebrating 40 years of liberation or the end of the war this week, we're also celebrating 20 years of normalization.
Yes.
And I would prefer to focus on the 20 years of normalization.
Yes.
Because the Vietnamese have, while the war is always going to be part of their history, not just our war, but the First Indochina War and the whole history of war, I think that our energies are best served on focusing on the next 20 years of normalization between our two countries. I think that's really crucial. So the first thing is they were struck by the friendliness and the openness of the people. This delegation traveled through China last year, and so I kept hearing comparisons between the two countries. And without making it, especially in the sensitive political context here, to a person, they enjoyed their time here.
Mm-hmm.
They thought the people were more engaging, more conversational. The country itself was more attractive. Traffic was much better, even though we think it's so bad down there, and the like. And certainly they raved about the food everywhere.
Uh-huh.
So all of that. And I took them today through bookstores And they were able to see my book Perfect Spy being sold everywhere, and they got a big thrill out of that. And we were in Hanoi, it was being sold, and, along with other books as well. But I remember a time in my first trip where you couldn't buy an English language book here. You couldn't do it, and you certainly couldn't buy a book like Perfect Spy. And now you can buy it anywhere in English, which is very interesting to me because of the differences in the Vietnamese and English editions.
Well, I was very fortunate to be at the launch of this book when it was launched 18 months ago.
That's
I think
correct.
now in this particular version. So tell us about this book and how you came. Maybe let's go back even further than that to start with. How did you become interested in Vietnam? What? There you are in the early 1980s, very critical of what was happening in America about Vietnam in its recent history. And you were beginning to take a very independent view of what American policy had been, I think.
Right.
What started that for you?
So now this question I've answered often, and it's interesting because for me, actually, it started well before I went to graduate school. Vietnam was the divisive issue of my generation.
Let's work out when you were born. Let's get a context.
I was born in 51. So
51.
Tomorrow I celebrate my 64th birthday.
Okay.
In 1968, 1969, when I got my lottery number,
A lottery number means
that I was going to get a lottery number was that the United States in the selective service system had instituted a lottery in which a birthday was picked out, and whatever your birthday was, that was a number that you had in terms of your draft. So your chances of getting drafted were very good if you were under 100. But I had a college deferment, and I was in the low hundreds. I was 111 or 112. And I had a college deferment, and then Nixon called off the draft. But in my home, the fights about Vietnam, the arguments at my dinner table between myself and my parents really centered on Vietnam and our policy. I always wanted to, as I matured, and when I went to graduate school at Princeton, and I studied under Fred Greenstein, my mentor, Fred introduced me to presidential decision-making and how presidents make decisions. And I waited, and I thought, what a great opportunity for me to take this graduate training that I was getting my PhD in on decision-making processes, advisory networks. And in 1980, I was working in the Johnson Library, and I was the first political scientist. Most people think I'm a historian, and I am. I've become a historian, but my PhD is in political science. But I don't consider myself anything except a political historian. I was working in 1980 in the Johnson Library, and the National Security Council histories were declassified the day I was there. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. And the National Security Council histories were the internal papers and debates and discussions, which were the flip side of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were the Defense Department. This was what was going on in the White House. And I was the first person. I wrote up a paper called The Making of the Decision, and I circulated. I was and Fred Greenstein asked me to come to Princeton. I was at UC Davis at the time as an assistant professor, and I presented the paper to McGeorge Bundy, William Bundy, George Ball, and in a small seminar. What an opportunity. There's some of the best and the brightest. And it was clear to me that I really was onto something. And in 1982, W.W. Norton published a book that is still in print today. It's my most successful book. We never talk about it here, but in 1982, I published Planning a Tragedy, which focused on the Americanization of the war in Vietnam, the decision of July 28, 1965, to take over the war. That book is still being sold in college classes today, taught around the country.
So you were a very young man when you wrote that. I mean, you were 29.
That's right,
30,
correct.
So you
Absolutely.
published it when you were 30.
Absolutely.
So you were thinking about it when you were 27, 28.
I was thinking about it when I was 18.
Amazing.
And so writing about it was, and then after that I published Lyndon Johnson's War, the making of a stalemate in Vietnam, and then of course I hadn't been to Vietnam yet, and I had written those two books, and then everything changed when I came to Vietnam a decade later, and I met Pham Xuan An. So
And then you could start looking at the world through Vietnamese eyes, as it were.
I
as
didn't
well
know.
right, I didn't know when I started that I would do that, but An helped me do that.
Uh-huh.
So it's very interesting to be a biographer and to write a biography, first of all, about someone who's alive, someone who you're speaking to daily, and also somebody who helps you understand the war from a completely different perspective.
Okay, so here is the book that is The Perfect Spy. Here we have it in English, and here we have it in Vietnamese. How did it happen that he allowed you to write about him?
Okay, so when I first met An, he didn't want me to write this book. He didn't want anyone to write a book about his life.
Mm-hmm.
It was fairly straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
So how I met him is worth me just spending a minute telling the story.
Please.
It was my first trip to Vietnam. It was my second day in the country. So I just talked a second day in the country, and I had been invited to a dinner hosted by Texas Tech University for several dignitaries in town at a restaurant very close to here. It was a very, very long table, that was sitting 22 people. And the only empty seat was directly across from me, and everyone around me spoke Vietnamese and didn't speak English. And I really didn't know what I was going to do, who was I going to speak to all night, right? And there was only one empty seat, and I just thought the person wasn't coming. And all of a sudden, a wiry old man, elderly gentleman walks in the room, and everyone treats him like he's a rock star. They all come over to him, and I hear Jim Reckner, the director of the Vietnam Center and the leader of our delegation, say, General An, how good to meet you. Good to see you. And An speaks English back to him. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm late. There was traffic. My motor scooter gave me problems. And there's only one seat. So Jim says, go sit next to Larry Berman, professor at UC Davis. And Pham Xuan An says, Davis? Oh, I love Davis. When I interned at the Sacramento Bee, when I lived in the United States, I stayed in Davis, and I knew Ellen Morgan McClatchy, and he walks over, sits down, and for the next 3 hours, he and I didn't stop talking to each other.
Wow.
And all he could talk about, I didn't even know who he was, by the way. I didn't know he was a spy. I didn't know anything about him. But for 3 hours, we just engaged each other. And then he asked me a question. He said, what are you working on right now? And I told him, I'm finishing a book that would eventually be published as No Peace, No Honor, Nixon, Kissinger, and Stalemate in Vietnam, which focused on the Paris Peace Accords, the secret negotiations. And again, I was the first person to have a lot of secret documents that I'd won through declassification. I had the recently published Vietnamese accounts of those negotiations, and I was offering a new interpretation. And I told An about that. And An said to me, you know what, and I didn't know who he was still. He says, you know, you should come to my house tomorrow. We should meet in Chevral Coffee House, because I know a lot about this. I know what those negotiations are about, and I can help you. And I said, okay, and he gave me his card, and I carry that card everywhere. Here's the card.
Wow.
And
He gave that to
He
you
gave me that card.
in
in 1999 or 2000.
Wow.
And the card has his lucky symbols, a German Shepherd and a bird, and we can talk about that later. He's very superstitious. And An said to me, come. But the problem was I was supposed to go the next day to Cambodia, to Siem Reap, and see some of the most significant Angkor Wat, and see some things that I really thought were who wouldn't want to go to Angkor Wat? And so I told him I didn't think I could see him, but he gave me his card and his phone number. And he said, call me. So as I was leaving the hotel, as I was leaving the restaurant, I spoke to my friend Con Lay from Texas Tech, and I said, this was the most fascinating man. Who was he? And then Con told me who he was. And I went back to the hotel. All my bags were packed. I was leaving at 7 o'clock the next morning, and I couldn't sleep. And I woke up at about, my alarm went off at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I went downstairs and I told the delegation I'm not going. I had a visa to Cambodia, but I felt that I was on the tail of something. Anyone could be a tourist. I could go to, and as I did, I can go to Angkor Wat at some other time in my life, but when would I ever have the opportunity to get to know Pham Xuan An? So I called down that morning at 9 o'clock, and he said, I'll meet you in Chevral. And we stayed there from 9 to 3. And we did that for 4 days in a row. And he gave me some amazing details that helped me publish No Peace, No Honor. He then read that book a year later, and he told me that he thought it was the best and most objective account of the Paris negotiations, and by that time I decided I wanted to write a biography of him. And I asked him if I could, and he said no. And he had turned down Stanley Carnow, who recently passed away. Stanley told me, and Ahn corroborated, that Stanley had gotten him a $500,000 advance from Macmillan to write his own memoir, and with Stanley's help, and Ahn turned that down because he felt if he ever revealed his secrets, he would harm too many people. And so for 2 years, Ahn kept saying no to me. I kept asking him if I could write it. But he kept saying to me, come and talk to me, come and talk to me. So I kept coming to talk to him. I had notes. We just kept going, but he said, no book, no book. And I honored that. I said, okay, but I just kept writing. And I had a lot of material. And then he was hospitalized. And he was going to die. There was no doubt about it. The front page of the newspaper had a picture of him. They were already memorializing him, saying that he only had a few days to live. He lost half of his lung. He was very weak, but he lived. And he came home. And he sent me a message, and he asked me to come and visit him. He sent me a message to a friend, and in that message he asked me to bring him 3 books that he wanted to read as he was convalescing. And about a month later I came and saw him, and I said to him, how are you? And he goes, well, I'm dying. I have a short time to live. And I said to him, well, you want me to write the book right now, right? Because you want your history just told by Vietnamese journalists. You want an American historian who didn't know you to write the book. And he said, yes, okay. And he thought he only had 6 months to live, but he lived for 2 years and 2 months. And so I kept coming back every month, month and a half. And so that's the story of how the book was written, whether or not. So learned a lot of lessons from that. But one is when opportunity knocks, open it, and things. That's a long story, but it's an
extraordinary.
And
but there's one very interesting little phrase that you had in the middle of that, which was about secrets, because one story that I've heard is that in 1975 he went with his family to America, and there they were living without any knowledge of the Vietnamese community of his past. And then something happened in Vietnam which revealed to the Vietnamese community that was in America of who he had been.
Right, so what happened, so this is...
so his secret got blown, as it were, is the point I'm making in a way.
But his secret got blown, he of course, he was working for Time magazine, right? And so Time evacuated all of its employees. So he sent his wife and 4 children to the United States, and he stayed behind with his mother. He did not go to the United States.
Okay.
And and the reason he sent his wife and 4 children was because he recognized the fact that what was he going to tell the Liberation Army as they marched into Hanoi? Was he going to into Saigon? Was he going to say, "Oh, I've been waiting for you. I'm really Pham Son An, and I don't really work for Time magazine"? They'd shoot him and they'd eat his dogs. That's what he said. So he evacuated his family because he's sure they would all be. They faced death. He thought that something terrible would happen. And indeed, he went into hiding for a period of a week or 2, and finally, somehow word was passed through that Ahn was really working for the other side. His rations increased. He eventually got out, and he was sent to Hanoi 2 years later. And in Hanoi, General Zia presented him promoted him to the rank of general and made him a hero of the revolution. That photo was then circulated, and in the United States, that's when they found out who he was. And Ahn then told his wife and 4 children, but his wife was in charge of this, that come home. And this was a period of time when no Vietnamese who had fled Vietnam were trying to come back in 1979. So that was when the real secret, and they had to take this circuitous route where if you were living in America and you were Vietnamese and you wanted to go back to Vietnam, you just couldn't get on a United or a Vietnam Air flight and fly in. Back then,
there were no flights.
Right, you had to go to the Soviet Union. So they had to go to Paris. They had to go to Moscow and work their way around like that. And apparently it took about 7, 8, 9 months for them to get back. But they finally did get back. And then, as I show in the book, all of his former friends, that's when the real discussion heated up. And many of those former friends are in Ho Chi Minh City today because, of course, all the journalists are back as well for this. they refer to themselves as the old hacks. The old hacks group is here. I ran into them the other day, and Peter Arnett and others are all walking around as great celebrities today, being treated very well by the Vietnamese government.
Yeah. Wow. 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 What an extraordinary life. What, if you can encapsulate it, what sense did he make of his life?
An?
An, yes. What would have been his single statement, if it's possible to encapsulate it in such a way?
Well, I think An felt that his life was a model for Vietnamese. He served
His country.
He
yes.
loved his country.
Yeah.
He loved America.
Uh-huh.
And I think in the end, indeed, as An told me, and as I say in the book, reconciliation was a day that he said he could die happy, because the two countries that he loved, the United States and Vietnam, were working together. So one of the great things about An that I've discovered is, so here's a man who dedicated his life to political intelligence, was, quote, a spy, okay? But how is it that a spy for the Vietnamese who worked undercover as an agent for Time magazine could be the VIP guest, along with his son, on the USS Vandegrift, the first U.S. vessel to come into Saigon Harbor in 1995, at the invitation of the U.S. Ambassador and Consul General of the United States? How is it possible for a man who is, quote, on the other side to have reached that position?
Extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
And also that in that sense of he loves Vietnam and he loves America, encapsulates this extraordinary dilemma which, as an English person coming into Vietnam over recent years, seeing Vietnam in relation to Americans and your colleagues in this trip, thinking we're not seen as enemies. And there's that, I understand, a great statement from Ho Chi Minh which said that we're not fighting the American people, we are fighting the American government. And it's a very interesting distinction, that.
Yeah, it's a complicated distinction, because I told my delegation, and some of them had a hard time even accepting it, understanding it until they got here. Then they said to me, we get it now. I said, I really feel lucky that the Vietnamese have forgiven us for what we did to them. I mean, what we did to them, for reasons that most Americans couldn't even tell you why, because Vietnam didn't matter to the United States. It was only what its loss was in terms of these two other countries, the Soviet Union and China. I mean, it was like Vietnam was a pawn on a chessboard in 1954 and in 1960. There wasn't anyone in the State Department who could have passed a high school civics exam on Vietnamese history, right? I mean, and the great irony of the war is that by 1979, Vietnam is at war with China, right? So they've forgiven us, which is remarkable. And
but do you think in that act of forgiveness, which does seem to be very real, it actually requires an apology as well?
Apology on behalf of who?
From America?
Well, I think that that's not going to happen. Those are politicians. I'm talking about people to people.
I know. Yeah.
The real apology should be in recognizing our responsibility for Agent Orange and what Agent Orange did in this country, and the United States' responsibility, what it should be there. But then again, Vietnam and the United States are working very closely on the repatriation of remains, MIAs. I mean, that's one of the great success stories of normalization. The way we are working together, the Vietnamese cooperating, at getting a pretty good price for this, but on MIAs, for example. So,
and I think you've been, when you were in Hanoi, you were with Vietnam Veterans of America
That's right.
Foundation a bit, weren't you? So
Yes.
that the work that is in fact going on between America and Vietnam is increasing. It's beginning to be a sense that we actually do have to finish this off. Though it's going to take a long time.
it's going to take a long time. One of the other people, we were in Hanoi, and we did meet with Tao Griffith, who was really helpful, and your organization was just so helpful as well. And then we went on to see Chuck Searcy, an American, who was doing incredible work, obviously, here in this country on demining and the real serious dangers that are occurring in Quang Tri and the like. But there's so much work to be done, and the agenda is a big one.
But the Prime Minister has made a very special thing of the new centre for demining that was opened I think just this past week.
Yes,
wasn't
yeah,
it?
yeah.
So there is a great focus which America is supporting quite substantially.
Right, and for
And
me,
yet there's room for more.
there's a lot room for more.
So for me, one of the things very heartening for me is the number of veterans who are coming back and are welcomed now here in Vietnam and their reaction, because many of them find a closure to things. And one of the things I've done in the last couple of years is I've taken 2 veterans back, very close friends of mine, who until they came back didn't find what they needed to go on with the rest of their life in a really significant and important way. And I tell that story actually in the book. I took up to see An, and An explained the war better than anyone had ever explained it to him. He was a great teacher. So, you asked me about his life too. He was a great teacher. But he was also, in the end, and this I think is sort of the core of his life, which is when you live undercover for this long, for 20 years, you can't help but to play that role. The reason he was able to survive was that he played his role so well that then when the war was over and someone said, okay, An, go back to what you were, who was that man?
Yes,
right?
yes.
So he was really the first of the first Vietnamese, I think, and the new regime who recognized that normalization was the future. And he quoted over and over, and I talk about this in the new edition of the Vietnamese edition. I write a preface called Looking Back Over the Last 5 Years. And one of the things An always quoted to me over and over again was Lincoln's words, his really powerful words following the Civil War, with malice towards none, with charity for all, recognizing that it was time for the American brothers, North and South, to put down their guns and work together for the future of their country. And An always talked about that as the model for Vietnam.
So if we bring it up to the present time, what's your hope now for Vietnam? What does a very informed foreigner, how do you see? We're talking about 20 years, we're talking about 40 years, but let's move ahead 20 and 40. What position is Vietnam? Okay, how does Vietnam represent itself now in the much wilder world? There's ASEAN, there's TPP, there are these huge pressures on Vietnam. And yet, I worry a little, as a relatively recent newcomer, maybe Vietnam will lose something in this process of itself. Because it's an extraordinarily resilient country. But how does it take it out into the world?
So that's a great question. It is the question that needs to be answered by all of us. My answer is that I think that the future of Vietnam rests in, again, this is from where I sit as an educator, in the education system, for example. I believe that the more and more students that study abroad, for example, and come back to Vietnam and work to turn Vietnam into the model that they want their country to be. With, I think, with greater, I think that the future of Vietnam must include, for example, there has to be a more, Vietnam is going to benefit extraordinarily from, trade and new market economy and everything that's going on right now. But there has to be a loosening in some of the areas of the press and the media and the like. I think this is really essential, and I think the young people are going to expect it as well. You can't study abroad and come back and not feel uncomfortable in that situation.
It's fascinating also if we move into the next generation, An's son, Hong, who encapsulates in a way this modern exploration of the world, because he's, I think, been educated in Russia, in Vietnam, in Russia, and in America, hasn't he?
Oh yes, and I tell the story about how yes, that's right. Well, so yes, and An wanted his firstborn son to have the same educational experiences that he had in the American system, because he felt that the American system was the only system that allowed your mind to not have just one answer, one way of thinking, etc. So he and all of his journalist friends raised somewhere between $80,000 for Hung to first go to North Carolina to study journalism, and then to Duke University Law School. And of course, he has now been a translator for 2 presidents. He's been in the White House more times than I have been in the White House. President Bush gave him a nickname, as a matter of fact, as he was very prone to. I don't know what the nickname was, but he does. You can ask him. And
and now he's coming back to Vietnam and is going to be part of Financial Business News Channel, which
Well,
is
that's great.
Extraordinary.
That's fantastic.
Coming back just as, that bridging all the time, wonderful.
That's right.
And and An, of course, made the big trade, and this is discussed in the English edition. It didn't quite make its way into the Vietnamese edition, but An always wanted to. When the war ended, An always wanted to come back to America, and he never did. And one of the trades he made was that he would zip up in return for his son being able to go to the United States. And that's exactly what happened. He toned it down a little, and the son was able to study in the United States. He recognized the importance of that.
So here you are at the end of this journey that you've been making with your colleagues.
Yeah.
You've been to Vietnam 55 times
Just
in
about.
15 years.
Yeah.
What's the next thing for you with Vietnam?
Well, I'm gonna. Hopefully, I'll be coming back a lot, working on the as a consultant on, and I have a role in that, playing myself, as a matter of fact, just as the biographer.
A consultant to playing yourself. I love that idea.
This is going to be made. The book is being made into a 32 episode dramatic television series. The script is written. The director is hired. The producer is set. The actors are all in line. We are simply waiting for someone in Hanoi to sign the license that says the dramatic recreation is consistent with the narrative of the book. I spoke to someone last night. We're certain it'll be approved, and that'll begin.
Wonderful.
And it's
And
it's
is
a
that
good
being
script.
done by a Vietnamese production company?
Yeah, Catienza based right here in Ho Chi Minh City, and they've been just fantastic to work with, and we're really excited about it. We're just waiting for the license to be approved, so which we are expecting to happen any day now, really.
Okay.
And that'll bring me back with some frequency. And now I'm going to start with my new book pretty soon, which will be a study of 3 generations of Vietnamese and Americans. This is dozens and dozens of people who have been affected by Agent Orange. And it's going to focus on the Agent Orange cover-up, the politics of Agent Orange, but all seen through the lives of veterans, their children, their children's children, who are both Vietnamese and American, and the Allies as well.
Yes, chemical weapons don't distinguish between nationalities, do they?
No,
Yeah.
and
As you know, there are areas of Vietnam where you still can't go and visit because of the hot spots.
Well, the work goes on.
It does.
Okay. Larry Bowman, thank you very much indeed for being with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. I've spoken with you all evening.